So, hello, everybody. Welcome to another session of the ADM podcast. Once again, I'm Don Jackson. I'm a chief technologist here at Micro Focus. And today's topic is test automation. So, GUI, API, headless, UX. Oh my! When should we do which? So with me today, I have a very special guest, one of my favorite people to chat with. We actually talk a few times a week now, unfortunately for him, Mr. Chris Trimper from Independent Health. Chris, if you want to just introduce yourself and so that people can understand who you are.
Oh, thanks, Don. Thanks for having me today. My name's Chris Trimper. I work for Independent Health. We are a healthcare provider where individuals and companies can get insurance. We are located in Western New York, and my role there is the test automation architect. And to really simplify things, I aim to perpetually add efficiencies to our testing process, whether it's assistance for and techniques for manual testers, business testers, or more frequently, enhancing our test automation process and really just helping to enhance the quality of our products for our members and providers.
So when you are talking with people who are outside of IT, how do you describe your role to them? Because I know we've had some conversations about this. I always get oh, can you help me fix my printer? And I'm like, no, dude, I cannot help you fix your printer.
Yeah, thankfully I got out of the fixing printer questions to my browser's running slow or I have a virus. And I feel like it's the same if you go to a party and you find out somebody's a doctor and like, oh, can you look at the rash on my back? No, I'm here for the party. So now, yeah, and that's actually why I shifted it to, my job is to add efficiencies to our testing processes. And that really helps do two things. One, it helps avoid those weird questions like, can you fix my printer? Hey mom, I'll still fix your printer if it's broken. Don't worry, I'm not saying that. But what it does do is it also opens up doors. So, it makes it so that I can't say, oh, day to day, all I can do is test automation or performance testing or, production monitoring or things like that. It opens up a lot of new doors to do things. So, I've done query workshops to teach people how to tune their queries or make querying simpler. And you like querying. Why would you do querying with testing? Well, it's a means to be able to enhance your scope, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about today, but it's also a means to get your fingers at more information. If in a query you can describe what it is you're looking for, you've done two amazing things there. You've given yourself a lot of data available to you, but you've also, if and when the data dries up, you have this lovely description of what is your data. It's almost like a descriptive method to go out and find the things that you need.
Awesome. So the topic today, and we talked a little bit ahead of time about this is, there's so many different types when we talk about functional testing, and yet I should have mentioned that at the beginning. This is really about functional testing. We certainly could talk about performance testing and other non-functional tests types, but specifically we're going to talk about functional testing today. And the kind of the Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my, right? GUI. There's GUI tests. There's API tests. There's headless tests. There's user experience tests. UI tests. How do you determine? How do you, as I'm going to label you as such, an expert in the field, right? How do you determine what tests you should run and thus what you should build?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. So I'm going to put timeline aside for the moment just because everybody's familiar with okay, I told them I have 10 days of testing to do, you have 5 days to do it, so now figure it out. Let's put that aside because that's a vastly different conversation. It all comes down to scope and requirements for me. So, understanding our requirements to determine, what is it that we're intending to do. A vast majority of what we do is we do testing on behalf of or for a user interaction or user functionality, whether it's a member logging into the portal, a provider going in and checking some patient records. Maybe it's actually a process on behalf of something like claims coming in from a hospital or from a particular supplier location. You go to the doctor and the claims processing come in. So we really look at how do we make sure that we are fulfilling that accurately? What are the things that we do? And there's really two types of things that occur in there. One is what sorts of interactions do I need to have to properly represent what's happening, to properly represent the user interacting with our portal. We need a browser. We need some data to go in there. That isn't one of those things where I would say, oh, I'm gonna, put on Wireshark or something, capture the things, and then write a bunch of curl commands. That's not really the same. So you need to make sure you're representing it properly. Secondly, I look at different kinds of prerequisite and post-requisite data. What do I need to bring into the test and what do I need to do at the end? A good example may be I need to log into the portal for someone wanting to make sure that their recent claims are showing up so that they know that it came in. So I would need claims on a person. Okay, maybe I have to inject a claim on a test member. It doesn't necessarily matter how I do that, it just needs to be done. So that gives me the advantage of looking at the scope of saying, well, I don't need to go into this weighty application and fill out some form and do it. I don't have to have EDI coming in. I can just inject that in. Maybe there's a REST call or a SOA call that we can do it with. And at the end of it, maybe one of the things I need to do is say, we have analytics that we want to understand our users' behavior on the portal and stuff like that. So at the end of the test, maybe it says, make sure that it logged what the user was doing so that we have a record of that, so that we understand what they were doing. It's part of their history and whatnot. That, again, do I need to log into an analytic platform and go through some weighty user interface? It's not the scope of the test. I can now do that from some backend APIs again. APIs or some kind of layer like that are something we're going to talk a lot about in here today, because it's the scope. I said I add efficiencies to the testing processes. Why would we do something long and horrific when it's not the intent of the test?
Yeah, I mean, a great example of that is I used to work on an ordering application, and there was some reporting stuff, like you could go in, the customer's large hospital. What's the right word? I can't even think of the right word. Where there's a bunch of hospitals together, a hospital conglomerate. A hospital conglomerate would centralize their purchasing, so they would have hundreds of orders that they have every day, right? And there was a report that would show you what are your daily orders that you have in there, so that they could, make sure that they weren't going over budget or in the central thing. Well, my role was to functionally test that report worked correctly. Well, there's a lot of test data that I have to set up for that. So how would I set up the test data? Would I run my functional test that by the way was already automated that would place an order? Would I run that for like 4 hours to create a bunch of orders in there? Well, no. What I ended up doing is I wrote a performance test that I could scale up to a couple hundred virtual users, and I ran that for like 5 minutes to seed all this data in there, and then I would run the functional test through the user interface for the report itself and verify that the report, the format was correct and totaling was showing up correctly and it was pulling correctly and, wasn't getting, the equivalent of a 404 not found on the order, right? So, but you're absolutely right. So the scope of my test was about testing the report. That test data management task that I had to do, I just need the fastest way to do that. And at the time, we didn't have a test data management tool where I could just, restore my golden copy of my data and off I go. I had to build it at the time. So I think you're absolutely right when you talk about that. So that draws us though into some of the another question that comes up a lot is we talked about going through the UI versus API and how you use both, right? And or database calls or whatever the most efficient way it is to do your prerequisite and your post condition test, right? But what about user experience, right? So I know you're a huge proponent of testing against the user experience. Can you talk about UI testing versus UX testing?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think now you're definitely going down that rabbit hole that Dorothy went down, and you're hitting the oh my territory. So certainly for anyone listening, know that this sort of thing doesn't just happen overnight. This takes quite a long time of maturity going through your testing organization to get to these things. So we're talking about UI versus user experience testing, and you might think, well, what's the difference? And there can be quite a bit, both from the intent of the test, what types of things you validate in the test, and actually the method in which you do it. So I think one thing to take away from this talk is know your options. So I want to take a tiny bit aside on the know your options bit, because you're thinking UI testing, API testing, maybe you bundle in headless into there, and user experience. Those are different techniques, and knowing your options and knowing your methods to do that are important. Same way with what we just talked about from the applications. I have a front end interface. Do I have APIs? Do I not have APIs? Do I have other mechanisms to batch load data in, get data out? Things like that. Knowing your options are important, because that helps you to make the appropriate decisions given your scope. Once you know your options, once you know your techniques, it actually starts to get easy, because you say, well, what's the intent here? What are we aiming to do? And what's the scope of my test? And now the options become clear, because you have, orchestrated out all those different things. So now back to the question at hand. So your UI testing is testing that the interface layer. How you test it, again, we're talking automation today and functional test automation, so I'm not going to talk manually much. Really comes down to, what do you have available, or what have you adopted for your framework? Are you interacting with the actual browser that's rendered? Is it headless? Is it something that, you're really just interacting with the DOM? It all depends on what framework you're using. We use
you
UST
mentioned
primarily. Oh, go ahead.
So you mentioned interacting with the DOM. So I get this. I haven't had this conversation a lot, and I experienced this myself. So let me paint you a scenario. So we were testing our e-commerce application, and we had brand requirements. Okay, and one of the brand requirements had, in our brand central area, we had the icons for the company, and I'm not going to specify what company it was, but we had the icons for the company, and in the application, the icon for the company did a specific thing, right? So you would click on the icon,
looked a certain way.
It looked a certain way, and it did a thing, right?
Uh-huh.
So what the developers did, and rightfully so, is they hyperlinked the image in the code to fetch it from Brand Central, so that no matter if they changed the image, right, how the image looked, they'd always get the latest version of the image when they were rendering the page. So we were writing tests that worked against the DOM, right? So if the object was there, and we could do a checkpoint to make sure that the object was sized correctly, right? That it had X by Y pixels, right? And if it was there, we could fire the method against it to do a user click, and off we went, right?
Yep.
Well, we had a change that occurred, right? We did the build, everything was successful, everything was passed, and it went live, and customer phone calls start immediately as it goes live and says, hey, I can't do this action because it's not there. Well, what do you mean it's not there? What? And so they come back to me, and they look at it visually, and it's not there, right? They can't see it. Well, what ended up happening is they changed that icon for the company, but they renamed it. So they took the old one and they made it _old, and the new one they made _new. Well, the code in the application went to the name without that suffix on it of _new. So it was still there in the DOM. It just was a small tiny little 1x1 X on the screen, because it was a 404 for that particular image. Yeah, no, and that's the example I use when I talk about UI versus UX testing, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're through UI testing, we all say we're testing the user interface, but what is the definition of the user interface is a big deal. We still today, from a traditional automation perspective, we leverage as testers the objects in the back end, which, yes, users interact with objects, but not in the way that our automated tests may. Users interact with objects visually. They don't interact with objects by doing some obscure thing saying, browser, I'm going to click on this convolutedly named object. They visually look for a thing, and if it's not visually there, then the user experience is bad. And what you just described is a perfect example of UI testing likely passing as we would expect it to pass, and then the user experience failing. And you might say things like, "Well, on maybe what we should have done is make sure that the it wasn't 1 by 1. It was, instead of greater than 0, it was greater than 20." But then you keep adding and adding and adding bounds, and you're still stuck in UI and not user experience. The user experience is vast, and it's funny because the way in which we determine a thing present varies differently from a UI testing to a user experience testing. When we talk about UI testing, or let's just talk about browser for the moment, because I would argue it seems lately that companies are going for browser apps more than much anything. It just seems. I mean, I could be wrong, but that seems to be what's in the news. Every browser this, browser that. Fine, no worries. So it's something easy we can talk about. When we talk about a browser, you know, present on the page just means that it's there somewhere. Um, Visual means that it's there with some sort of size. From a UI testing perspective, you go to user experience, that means that it's visually present there. Things that can be problematic is it's below the fold. Is there anything that tells the user or gives the user any idea that they might need to scroll down or scroll up, or hopefully not left or right, because that's really bad, but maybe it is left or right. Is there something that shows them they need to move that view frame that they have around to see the thing and interact with it? Other times it could be, I mean, this is the silliest example, but one might argue, Don, the thing you just mentioned, that would never happen. Obviously it did, has, and probably has before. Weird things like white text on a white background. Style sheets can go awry. That could happen. Is it present? It is present. Is it visible? Not unless you have the wackiest idea to click on the page and hit Control A, where it selects all the text and magically makes that thing appear like a magic eye chart. So
well,
there's
one of my favorites when you talk about is it there is not it's not where it's not visible, it's where you have word wrapping happening, right? So
we've seen that.
I've had this.
Yes.
I've had it in my own personal life and in work, where I'm encountering a last name that's like 35, 40 characters, and the developer only gave 20 character slot, so it word wraps over it, and the thing that's underneath that is visually underneath that the last name field is now covered up by that last name. And even worse, it could be, instead of just word wrapping the text, that text box could have a fill on it. So you can't even see that there's now an object underneath it, because it's now gone like this, right? And now I can't even see it anymore. So I mean, it's the example I gave earlier was probably more rare that happens, but absolutely people have last names. I mean, I worked in retail in my first career, and I worked for a company that no longer exists, but we would yell out the customer's name when the item came out of the warehouse, right, to deliver it to them. And dude, some of those names on those tickets would get really, really, really long, right?
Yeah, I mean,
I'd
you're
like to
talking
buy
the
a
label
vowel,
going
right?
around the Starbucks cup twice.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is a reality. Unfortunately, a lot of times when we do some sort of testing, especially depending on how much time we have available to ourselves, we might just do, I don't want to call it happy path. I don't want to give bad name to testers, but being able to do all that boundary testing may not be in our time, in our capability. In addition, having to prepare for all of those things with automation is really difficult. And I think maybe now might be an interesting time to start talking, instead of um, like, I'd say right now we're talking all theory and concept, but maybe even talk about, well, these are great theories. Well, what in the world do you do to actually make these things happen? Right?
Yeah.
So, we're in a really fun time when it comes to test automation. There's so many techniques and mechanisms available, and really we're at a place where we can actually really work with the interface. If you go to your old example with an icon, maybe that you had to make sure that the icon had independent health. There's a red apple. Maybe you have to make sure there's a red apple. Why would it be anything but a red apple? I have no idea in the world, but maybe just pretend maybe it could be a different color. In the past, you'd have to do something that most would say is like a bitmap testing, where unless every test machine had the exact desktop resolution and the browser was the exact size with the exact DPI and things that'll just make your head spin, you wouldn't be able to have any sort of visual acuity to that. Well, now we're in a place where we can actually have, the computer look at an interface and can I use the term AI here? I know it's a overused term, especially given all the events this year with chatbots and all that stuff, but we can use different rendering mechanisms to determine whether or not that apple on the independent health icon is red, or that the whole icon itself or logo is accurate, and it's fast and it's snappy. Who
That it's
cares
an
about an
apple.
icon? Yeah, that it's an apple for sure. And you might think to yourself, well, why does that matter? Well, let's go back to the user experience discussion. And maybe the user experience says you need to make sure that you can click on the independent health logo and it takes you to the right place. Well, in the past, how would you have clicked on it? You'd have to do something like you had mentioned before, or you'd have to say, well, there's a div that says logo, so we're going to click on that. Are you clicking on the logo? Are you really? I'm not trying to play devil's advocate here, but you can't factually say that you are. Now we switch to user experience testing and modern techniques, and I can legitly say, click on the logo that has the text independent health. I can analyze it. I can do all kinds of cool things with it depending on the scope. And here we'll give this the Peter Parker great responsibility talk. With great power comes great responsibility. And I'm a massive proponent of not asking, what can I do with my application? What should I be doing? Those tests, those requirements, that scope gives us guidelines of what should we be doing for our tests. So just because you have new techniques and you're like, oh man, we're going user experience testing, this is freaking great. Really got to focus on what should you be doing? What is the intended user experience? What are we doing? And we have, kind of fast forward to today, we have shifted, especially for our mobile app, shifted to user experience testing or user experience driven testing. We're using, I'll throw out some terms that we can talk about in a minute. We're using a kind of a low code mechanism where we are doing visual testing. There's a lot of terms we'll get into in a minute. But we shifted to user experience testing, and it's funny you mentioned that word wrapping thing. It's happened. You think about mobile phones, and developers like, I got this big fat phone in my pocket, so it's this big. But some of the users have phones like this, and all of a sudden you get wrapping and weird things that happen and stuff. Also phones height. I mean, we've gotten so many interesting things that we've found, and we've been able to save and preserve our user experience because of using these new techniques. And we're finding these defects way before we hit production, ensuring a proper user experience because we're able to have a testing mechanism that allows us to focus on user experience.
Yeah. So you talked. You brought up one of those key words that I hear a lot of people talk about is low code. So when it comes to writing your test automation, there's low code, there's no code, there's coded, full coded. What's your thoughts on those three different things, and what's your interpretation of what they mean?
No, for
in
sure.
the context of test automation, right? Functional test automation is the context. Just so the audience knows, right? We're talking about functional test automation now.
Yes, absolutely. Still in the functional test automation realm. So let's start with coded. So in various things I've had a chance to talk about, you'll hear me mention traditional automation. I really refer to that as coded. That's where we're leveraging some language. We're writing actual code, and we have to do some kind of, depending on the tooling you're using, some kind of description of an object in a coded sense to be able to interact with it. Because remember, we're still talking about functional testing, and a lot of the topic of talk so far has been UI and UX. So there's an object that we have to interact with, whether it's a textual link, a visual button, whatever it may be. We still have to have a way to describe that thing through code. So the coded is where we're looking at things that way. And I suppose I should throw something out there that, you hear these 3 doors you have to go down. It's not like a choose your own adventure. You choose one door and that's it. That's all you get. There's a lot of opportunity to say, well, for this path, I'm going to choose door number 1, primary, but I know that door number 2 is still available to me. I can still use those techniques. A good framework or a good infrastructure for your testing allows those options. And we leverage those today. So coded, I think that's the stuff everybody knows today. Low code, no code, that's could be a weird new area for some people. So low code, some individuals may have low code stuff today. I've seen some frameworks that implement low code, and that's where you can describe a little bit more simply things. In fact, a bunch of tools started out way back with a keyword view type thing. And that is low code, to me at least. In fact, I'm going to mention 2 tools that might actually make technology melt in this podcast wipe from existence. But you have the Mercury tools that eventually turned into UFT, and you had Selenium. I know I'm probably not supposed to say those 2 words in the same sentence, but you had those 2 tools, and they both actually started off with keyword view. Whether they realized it or not, they both started off, okay, I can't speak to Mercury, but quick test for sure. They both started off with low code, because there was this vast new technology and nobody really understood how to use it that well. We had to have an interface to work with it. Low code, keyword view. That is an example of low code, whether people want to even admit that it still exists today. We use some of the techniques with UFT1 today for low code, where there's a new library or engine out there called AI Util, which allows us to send simple statements to it. I could say AI Util, there's a button, it's called login, click it. That's still code because it's AI Util, parameter 1, parameter 2, dot click. It's still code, but it's low code. The amount of effort and insight needed to do the object description, to do the click, to do all the things that it does is there. Some individuals might think of different levels of abstraction that they've added to their framework as lower code. And I don't know, Don, what do you think? Is there a definitive definition that this is the boundary of which low code starts and stops? Because I would argue it's a gray area, but it certainly is lower or low code. It's easier to work with.
Well, I think lower by definition would be low, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, anything that you can do to abstract out and reduce the number of keystrokes that you have to do as a automation contributor you're getting into the low code. Now, the question is then the scale of the low code, right? So there's an example. In fact, I have on our YouTube channel an example of a low code and no code conversation to talk about that shows examples of that. So I mean, you can get pretty far down that low code path. I think for me, as somebody who's been doing this, that because I've earned my white beard. Yeah, you got the white beard going too. The definition of low code is really about reducing the amount of code that I have to as an automation contributor to write code. And as you reduce the amount of keystrokes that you have to do, you also reduce the barriers that you have to doing that. So the technical barriers, right? So a lot of people back in the day would write these very complex frameworks that might have keywords in it, have huge function libraries that get loaded up. I mean, I used a tool back in the day that we had everything were in function libraries, and we loaded up these massive function libraries at the beginning of a test, and then but you could have a junior automation person that could go in there and they could just start typing in and they'd get, the IntelliSense would bring up the function and off they went and they could write automation without having a whole lot of knowledge, right? But we also needed then a framework admin and a framework admin team that would own parts of the framework, and so the barrier to adoption went down for getting contributors, but the barrier to adoption became higher for the actual from a customer perspective, because I had to have a true expert, right? I didn't have to have somebody who was pretty good at the tool and understood the tool. I had to have an expert that could go in and maintain my framework. So that all comes back to the whole low code conversation, right? Anything that lowers your code. And when you talked about the AI utility, I think that's a fantastic example of a vendor, in our case, us, delivering something to you that can lower your adoption without having to increase that admin work of being able to do that.
Yeah, in fact, that's actually an awesome point, because we'll call it modern day definition of low code from the past is starting to be who owns that abstraction, who owns the responsibility for building it and maintaining it, and who benefits from it. In the past, it was you at your company had to have some digital wizard that could do all that stuff, and you had to make sure they stayed, because if they went, you might have been in trouble. Now we're at the point where vendors are offering that as a low code feature. And that's been a big benefit, because it's helped us reduce the amount of lead time to being ready for automation for a thing, because it's all that stuff's just there. But in addition, we benefit from the advancements. So we don't have to have a separate team advancing those low code features. They're advanced while we're doing our work by the vendor and delivered to us through periodic updates, maintenance, et cetera. So I think that's actually probably a funny time to mention. To me, I'd be looking at this podcast going, there's free tools out there. Well, there is a cost to those free tools, and this is my 2-second soapbox on there's a cost to everything, and it's really figuring out where and why you want to spend that. We invest in tools like the Micro Focus tools so that we gain those perpetual updates and the benefits of being able to have less woes in our scripting, building, maintenance perspective, but also, like I just mentioned, while we're doing our work using the abstraction through a low-code solution, they're out there working on perpetually improving that, they being Micro Focus, and we benefit from it with, paying for a enterprise-grade product.
I think that also when you deal with that, because it's the old buy versus build, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have very smart people. Why can't we just build it? Absolutely, you could, but how much of your smart people's time do you want to spend doing non value added work, right? So they're building the thing, they're building the framework, or they're building the tool instead of reducing
doing work.
Doing the work that adds efficiency into your business and value back into your business. So we've talked about coded and low code, but what about codeless? So I know, or no code. So you and I have talked a lot about this and some of the things that are kind of they're really in my mind they're at the forefront, right? We're starting to get to the bleeding edge of what technology is. Another aspect of AI is natural language processing. So I know you've had some experience. You're just starting to cut your teeth on some no code stuff. So what's your thought? What's the value proposition of no code?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So you're right. We are at a point where things that are codeless, no code, those two terms, at least for me at this time, are synonymous. And first off, to folks listening in on this, what is that? There's code somewhere, right? That's not untrue. I'm going to change the term codeless and no code to instructions. To me, codeless and no code are instructions. What are instructions? They're just directions on how to do a thing. You talk about the simplest test that everybody ends up having to have. It's login. So in a coded and low code, you have to deal with objects. In a no code, we can say things so simple that says enter username X, so Chris, enter Chris into the username field. That's it. No magic, no nothing, just a sentence. Simple instruction. That is a codeless, no code instruction that's able to be provided to a solution and then orchestrated through the automation to do a thing. So you think to yourself like, whoa, that sounds a lot like a test step in a test case. Yeah, it is. It's pretty wicked and pretty cool. So codeless and no code, yes, I do realize it's yet more abstraction. And there are some people that are worried out there about their abstractions and whatnot. But, at some point, it's definitely worth a look. But that level of abstraction does so many things. It allows us to have almost auto documentation of a test. You look at the coded versus low code versus no code, the same steps. If you look at them in coded, it takes, some understanding to know what the heck's going on there. You look at low code, you might be like, well, I don't understand what this thing is, but I kind of get the feel that it's telling me to click on a button. You look at codeless, no code, whatever you want to call it, you look and you go, yeah, we're logging in by clicking on that button. Easy peasy.
Because it says click the login button.
Yeah, exactly that.
That's
it's
what
an
it
instruction set. I almost would wish that we could have just said, I know we have to offer the term, or they offer the term code in the description of it because it's an evolution of code, but to me it's an instruction. It's a list of instructions on what to do, or directions, however you want to think about it. It's not code by any means whatsoever. In codeless solutions I've seen, the only code-like things is we do or should, I know we do with codeless solutions we use from Micro Focus, but it should offer up the opportunity to like inject a parameter in there. Like you wouldn't want to have one test for login with Chris, where it says login with hard-coded Chris. Here's my hard-coded quotes. To the username field, and then a separate test that says using the word hard-coded Don login to offer the ability to drive data into it is key. That's the only coded like things I've ever seen in these codeless, no code solutions. And what's epically amazing out of this for me is the audience. The audience can change. This isn't a code this is going to automate away all the test engineers in the world type of situation, much like, a long while ago, testers said, oh my gosh, these test engineers are going to automate me out of a manual job. I don't think that happened anywhere. But what did I start off by saying? Test efficiencies, adding efficiencies to the testing process. What if a codeless solution could be handed to a tester and says, here's this thing you can use? It's giving you the power to automate. Can I tell you what will automate every single scenario you'll come against? I don't know. I don't know all the scenarios you're going to come against. But what if? Let's just pick a small threshold number. What if it could do 25% of your tests and aid you? What if you could, through simple instructions, provide those instructions, allow it to run somewhere, and work alongside you? You're saving 25% of your testing time. Sounds like a huge win in my book. And not to mention, didn't we just say there's simple instructions? To me, that's a self-documented automated test. Nobody needs a special understanding of a framework to know what the heck this test is doing. And it's clear without any doubt what that test is meant to do.
Yeah, when it comes to highly regulated environments where you have to prove that the automated script did what it was supposed to do, man, to have that documentation already there, it's an instruction, right? Like you said, it's not a script. I think another key point is what you talked about earlier is that I still have those other two doors available to me if I need them.
Yeah,
right?
you do.
I want to go down the no code door if I can, but there may come into some complex business logic that to build into a codeless, to do a bunch of if then statements. Boy, I really wish I could do a case statement, and maybe the no code solution doesn't have a case statement in there because I've got like 15 different options I want to do instead of doing 15 if then else. Right, nested if then else's. I want to do a case statement. So, okay, for that business process, I'm going to go down the low code path.
Yeah.
Or maybe I have a bunch of coded stuff that's already there. Well, I can continue to leverage that, but the new stuff I'm going to do in a no-code environment. So the other thing that it brought to mind when you were talking about this, you were talking about scripting once, with parameterization is, what about the challenge that you have if I'm testing at the UX level and I'm not testing the API or the database directly, and I'm testing it through the user experience. What about the multiple platforms and devices, right? So I'm thinking about, you were talking about, hey, my developer built it for, his phablet that he has, right? That's a phone tablet, by the way, guys. And for those of you who don't know what that is, a phablet. So he built it for the phablet, but this person, I look at my observability from production, and the most common used phone is an iPhone 7. Guess what? That real estate's way smaller, right?
Maybe
Way
living
smaller
space.
than the iPhone 14, right? So what do I do? Is there a mechanism for me to script it? Are there benefits? I know I'm doing a leading question. I apologize. I can't help myself, right? But to script it once and play it back on multiple devices, multiple platforms. Are you experiencing that with all of these innovations?
Well, actually, you bring up a good point that I don't know if you meant to or not, but when we first took on this new round of mobile app development, and knew that we were going to be, testing it, and we knew that this was going to be such a huge effort that without test automation, we'd probably be only able to do like 4 releases a year, but we wanted to do almost a monthly release. So, that's a huge, quantity of releases on top of what we could handle manually. I looked at it and I started looking at the options again. Know thy options. Figure out what the heck you can do. Started looking at it, and immediately I said, there is no way I want to have to retain, and I'll use the term object repository for a minute. I do not want to have to maintain an object repository for an iPhone and an object repository for Android. That's just not happening. Don't want to do it. That was just a line in the sand I did not want to cross. And so there's got to be a better way. And that's where we started looking at the solutions and eventually adopted this visual testing, which led us down the path of UX testing, looking at the user experience. And because we're actually looking at the rendered visual content, if all of a sudden tomorrow a new company came out with a new phone that we could magically have our app on, I would be covered like that, because the user experience, what's rendered is exactly this. It would be the same. There's a user, again, we're talking about a login because it's simple and everybody knows it. There's a field that's visually identified as a username field. There's a field that's visually identified as a password field. And there's a button that's visually and textually identified as the login button. So where they are, as long as they're rendered on the ginormous phone or the itty bitty phone, whether that phone came from Android, whether that phone came with iOS, it doesn't matter, because now that we've altered ourselves to look at the user experience testing, I don't care what's underneath the hood. I don't care about the number of pixels on the screen much. I care about the user experience. And as long as we have that, it's there. And you might be thinking about weird things like, well, you talked about a login form that's simple. That's going to fit on every screen. What if I'm talking about this thing that requires scrolling? In our case, we can instruct it to just say, find it. So it's going to look, it doesn't find it. What's the normal user going to do? They're going to swipe up and they're going to keep looking, right? Or scroll down, depending if you're in a browser. Speaking of which, and I know I'm taking this all over the place, well, now we said, so it's funny how the lions, tigers, and bears on my experience is fitting in this in every sort of the way. Android, iOS, those are devices. Tablets, like legit tablets, like an iPad. Okay. Desktops and desktop browsers. I'm running out of fingers. All of those different things, the experience. Well, if the experience, again, we're talking something silly and simple like login, just because it's something that we have that can talk about. A visually identified field for username, a visually identified field for password, a visually identified field for the login button. Maybe some message that you care to make sure is there, like for a reset password, or if you don't have a login, register here. So now I'm adding more objects, right? So we're up to 5, 6, 7 objects. Maybe that the login's there. So let's just pretend there's between 8 to 10 objects that we need to interact with. Because we switched to user experience testing, I can accomplish all of that, and I don't need all my fingers. I can accomplish that with one script because it's one user experience across all of the platforms.
I think that's so because I lived as an automation guy before this capability existed, right? So before companies like us started leveraging computer vision to visually identify objects on the screen. And dude, when we there was a point where we didn't build a mobile app because it was going to be too hard to test that mobile app, because we had a team of automation people that did the browser, and we just said, you know what, we're just going to use the browser on a mobile device. We're not going to build a native app because it would be too hard to test that, and it would be too costly to maintain. As you mentioned, object repositories, however you're doing it, right? Whether you're using descriptive programming or object repositories or some combination thereof, or some fancy, because I've done it as well, right? Where you build enough regular expressions into your descriptive programming that sure, it can find the object probably almost on everything, but then again, that's my barrier to adoption too. Now I've got this incredibly technical script that's incredibly hard to read and no one else can maintain.
Yeah, and
so
fragile.
And can be very fragile. So another thing that I think is interesting in there as well. So you talked about the login button and having that it has a textual identification to it as well. We're now building into their what I like to call, and this is not an official name, but is analogous word engine, right? So if it says log in, all one word, if it says log space in, if it says sign in, all one word, if it says sign space in, if it's mixed case, if it's all uppercase, it just recognizes it all as the same thing because of the analogous word engine that's in there. Is, well, you told me to look for login and I see sign in, so my confidence level's gone from 98% to like 87%, but that's still over my confidence threshold, so I'm going to click on it, and if it turns out it's wrong, you can tell me it was wrong, and then we'll go back and fix it. So I think that's super.
Talk your average user.
Yeah,
your average user is going to look at your app. They're going to have app build 1.0, and it's going to say sign in. And some marketing person didn't like the word sign in and they wanted to say login for whatever reason. They're going to get the app update in its version 1.2, and they're going to go, are they going to see login and go, oh, I don't know what to do? They're going to say, I understand the experience of this. I'm going to type. I mean, the irony is I would argue a large majority of people see username, password, may never even click the thing. They may just hit enter, or they may just click whatever buttons underneath it.
Yeah.
Like they might not even read that thing because that's the experience that we've done. A great example. Don't anybody do this. It's a bad idea. If ever they flipped the username and password field so it was password username, I guarantee you'd have like some 90% of people that wouldn't be able to log in. Caveat those people that opt to use autofill because it would still work. But if you actually had to type it in, they would type their username into the password field and their password in the username field, and they go, holy cow, I can't log in. What's going on? And then they'd probably have an epic freak out because they're like, oh my gosh, my password's in clear text. But it's a user experience thing. And it's interesting because this is now the user experience. You can, with some really nifty things, through some things I don't understand, some AI stuff or machine learning or whatever it may be, that understands like terms. I wish I could remember the exact thing. I think we had a thing where a person could choose to add coverage, and it either went from add or link to one to the other, and the team had a freak out because automation didn't catch the textual change, and we had to have a long discussion about how we're now shifting our efforts to be more user experience based. And a user, if they saw, well, ironically, if you link your coverage, you never see that button again. So the same user would never see that button unless, of course, they bought a new plan or something weird like that. But from a user experience perspective, does it matter if it says add coverage or link coverage? Isn't it wicked that my test just knew that those kind of meant the same thing and just kind of carried on? I mean, that's cool. I mean, do I want it to be obscure? No, but I mean, to have that happen is just
would a user
so
not
cool.
be able to get coverage, right? I think that's the real question that you're
Right?
trying to answer is would this stop the user from being able to use our app? And the answer is
No,
no.
not at
So then
all.
I don't want it to fail, right? I only want it to fail if the end user wouldn't be able to do their job or their business process that they're running through it. It's funny that you mentioned earlier about and it tied two things together. So you mentioned about how a lot of times they just click on the button that's below the username and password, right? They don't even
Yeah.
read what it says.
Might
And
not, might not. I don't want to
they
say
might
that
not.
people are silly. They might not.
And you talked about earlier about about how contrast matters, right? The contrast between text and background matters. So I have
From a visual acuity, yes,
I
it
had
can.
a COTS application, a commercially available off-the-shelf application, where the sign-in button was a gray button with cream-colored text. I couldn't read it. So how do I automate that in a UX from a UX perspective? Well, first off, is I sent back feedback to the development team and said, this is bad. You need to fix this. But the second part of it is I just did a visual of what we call a VRI, visual relative index. Is I said, I don't care what text is on there, just click on the button below the password
Yep.
and just click on it. And
Yeah,
so I was able to automate that step and off I went.
yeah, I actually had a similar thing with a off-the-shelf app, and it was some open source weird project, so there was really nobody to reach out to, but I was just tinkering with it, just to try out the engine. And it was one of those things where after you started typing in it, so the username and password fields said username and password, but as soon as you clicked on it, those things went away. So there was nothing visual to say that this field is the password field and this field is username field, other than the fact that username was on top and password was below. So again, I had to do the same thing where you could say, you know, given the scope and given the expected user experience of this test, I know that the first field is the username field and the field below is the password field, or more importantly, the field that's directly above the login button is the password field, and the field above that is the username field. So yeah, again, sometimes you have to put on your hat of, I'm describing to my great aunt or uncle or someone in your family who isn't the most tech savvy, who finds out that you're in testing, so that must mean you work with computers and it must mean you know how every single application in the world works, and they call you up and they say, how do I use this thing? And if you happen to understand how that thing works, you're not going to describe it to them by using objects and weird things like that. You're going to describe it from a user visual experience perspective. And that's kind of how it works. Now,
Yeah.
one real quick thing as a word of warning and something that helped us be successful. Don, you mentioned that button and you couldn't see it. Let's pretend that was your internal application. I highly advise, if you go down the route of doing something that's user experience testing, to actually work with your designers or your UX team and tell them that we are now taking this shift. Do expect there could be some defects coming in that are of a positive light. These are things where you don't have to have negative Facebook and Twitter reviews saying, oh, they just put out this app and I couldn't figure out what to do because it was a red button. I don't know what it meant to do, and it was just a crappy application. By shifting to doing user experience testing, you help take care of a lot of those things. But I do encourage you working with your teammates to let them know that you may be shifting the mechanism and the techniques that you use for testing, and that there could be some things coming. I can't imagine there being a team out there that wouldn't be grateful for that. And ours was very grateful. In fact, we have some funny laughs because every once in a while we'll have this weird thing that happens and they're like, yeah, we just didn't expect it to work that way, but we're really glad you caught it. Once we had a modal that showed up on an app, and we caught this, so nothing bad happened. But there was no visual thing that you could scroll through anything. I didn't know you can scroll on. I just saw this thing. I'm like, this thing is now blocking the application. I can't click off of it like I would expect to. What do I do? And funny enough, it was developed for a phone on a phone emulator this big. We were using a phone this big, like the iPhone, I think 7 Plus, something like that, or maybe it was some older Pixel. I can't remember. But basically, what happened is the content showing was this big. The content that was there was this big. Between here and here was a button. Couldn't see it, couldn't click it, didn't know it was there, had no idea it was something you could scroll through. User experience testing. If you were to leverage the objects, I almost guarantee if you did object description, whatever way you choose, it would have worked. And unfortunately, you would allow a poor user experience, or that could actually be perceived as a functional defect to go to production.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I'm very curious to get your thoughts on is that a big disadvantage that people experience with user experience testing is, but my application is slow. So now my execution, so you start to laugh, but this is something that happens, right?
Oh, it
My
it it
test
does. It
execution,
does.
when if I'm interacting directly with the DOM, my test execution might take, on this particular application, it takes 2 minutes to run through. If I actually do user experience and I got to wait for everything to render on the screen, oh my gosh, dude, this 2 minute test is now going to be 20 minutes. That's
Well,
unacceptable. I can't have my test run 20 minutes. What do you say to that?
well, two things really. Again, we're going to go back to scope. What are we supposed to be doing here for a test? What's important for this test? What are we aiming to do? If the intent of the test was just to get to the page that was nested 4 layers deep, again, because you're not forced to choose one of those doors, or hopefully in your solutions, you're not forced to choose one of those doors, maybe you choose to not do anything user experience testing until you get to that 4th page. That's an option. But if the user experience throughout the whole thing is important, well, if a user's got to wait 20 minutes to go through all those things, isn't it accurate if your test is waiting that same sad 20 minutes? I remember this is many years back with many old bits of technology. I think one of our earlier portal things when sadly waiting 30 seconds to log into something or more was realistic. But I remember once a director or somebody looking at a report going, "Your numbers are wrong." I mean, I don't make up the numbers. I don't have the time to make up numbers. You think I have the time to sit at a spreadsheet and make up numbers? I mean, that's nice of you to think that I have that kind of free time, but I don't. These are the numbers there. So we sat down and I sat with the horrible stopwatch app. I said, log in. I did it and I showed them the thing, and it was off by a delta, not by much, but let's face it, every login's not going to be the same. And they're like, oh, user experience. And it is something that we've sloughed off for a long time because of that premonition of, yeah, but it's too slow when I do it that way. Well, if you're okay with having a poor user experience, then fine. By the way, I know we're talking about functional test automation. I am not saying that now to do your performance testing, you have to have, if you want 1,000 users, you have to have 1,000 machines with 1,000 browsers. They are different concepts. Is it a good idea to maybe run some stuff in conjunction? Maybe run one of your user experience tests while there's performance testing, so you know the user experience while there's performance? Sure. Look to your requirements or to what you think is the intent. I don't want anybody to infer to say, well, Chris said that user experience is so darn important and Don said the same thing, so everything must be user experience testing. Not what we're saying. It's about your scope. What is it that you're doing? I know we kind of mentioned APIs for a minute, but again, it's a scope thing. I'm just mentioning it because I can't talk enough good about leveraging APIs. But let's say your test is, let's say you're going through the user experience of updating a person's email address. Go through all the flows, do the thing. User experience is great. And you want to say, well, did that really update? Is it important for you to go through the user experience again in a different app to make sure that the backend marketing tool got the email address? I can't tell you. What does your test say? If your test actually wants you to do that, and that's the intent of it, do it. Fine. If it's not, consider seeing if you have some sort of an API that says, get the member's current email address. Get it, compare it to what you did, validation done. You not only tested the user experience we were supposed to, but you tested in a very efficient and accurate way that your expected results were true.
So you talk about efficiency, and this is probably the last thing that we'll talk about because I know we've gone way longer than normally I go on these. I'll probably break this into two sessions, a part one and a part two. But so one of the questions that is asked more and more frequently now is what's the difference between RPA, robotic process automation, and test automation? Right? They're both automation, right? And is there a reason that I can't use my tests to do my RPA tasks, and vice versa, right? If I've got an RPA task, why can't I just run it as a test? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, thanks for giving us a reason to split this now into 3 segments. So the shorter version is, I mean, at the heart of it, RPA and test automation harness an immense amount of the same technologies, if not all of the same technologies. But we're talking about intent, and back to that lovely S word, scope, and probably bringing in another dirty word that nobody likes to talk about, which is requirements. So real quick, if RPA isn't known, RPA is robotic process automation, or orchestration, depending on what you look at it for. And it's the means to have a non-person do tasks that normally a person may have to do. What's interesting about RPA is RPA typically doesn't focus on user experience, meaning that when it comes to RPA, if there's 3 ways to do a thing, you may say, I just need to do the fastest and or most reliable thing. I don't necessarily need to drive the interface. Again, depending on what is the requirement. Honestly, there's also times that, and this kind of probably speaks against what you were thinking, Don, that you need something automated. There may literally be just that interface. And also, it may be near improbable to describe the objects in the interface with any sort of anything that's not like low code or even no code. It might be easiest or the only solution you have to use the rendered interface. But it's about knowing your product, knowing your tools, knowing your scope. Having that knowledge is important. But at the end of the day, RPA, there's really not much of a reason to focus on the experience. Therefore, if I can do it through the API, if I were to make a decision tree, my first thing would be is, can I do it through an API or a series of APIs? Because that's snap, snap, snap fast. If not, can I maybe adopt some techniques that might be used from functional performance or performance testing of some degree, and use some curl-like commands, HTTP posts, or direct network interaction? Heck, could some developers and I, or whoever's responsible for RPA, write a stored procedure and do an injection into a database? I don't want to freak people out and say, oh my gosh, we got to go deeper and deeper and deeper. What is the appropriate path? Some of it is, what are you looking to get out of it? What are you bringing to the table as inputs? Because what you wouldn't want to have is something silly that says, okay, so when an order comes in that has these 5 pieces of information, it has to go to a person to add the 6th piece of information to go through. What did we just do there? All you did was just make a bot sit along and pair with a person. But you want to do that. And one last thing about RPA is, I've run into 2 types of RPA. RPA that's typical, just keeps running. It just sits there waiting for stuff to do. But I've also run into, I don't have a word for it, so I'm going to call it situational RPA, where it's like, oh, we have this data manipulation thing to do. We have 9,000 entries in that are in our contact list, and for some reason they're missing country code, but we have no batch process, no database access, and all we have is this form to drive, and we need those, I don't remember how many I just said, more than 100.
9,000.
9,000 records updated. Can you help us? At that point, yes, the lines do start to blur in terms of RPA and test automation, but I guess the shorter version is, it's what's your intent and what's your scope and focus, and user experience is not typically part of that. Efficiency is, and reliability too.
Yep.
Never ever have I seen a web page not load in full and cause an error that would have totally horked up my RPA. But almost never have I seen an API decide to say, I'm only going to half work today. So
I think you hit the nail on the head. Is RPA, from my perspective, RPA is about task automation, right? So I'm trying to automate a task so that a human can move on to more meaningful tasks that are business relevant, right? So, for example, onboarding a new person and at the company, right?
Yeah.
If you use SAP in the back end, right, you got to create an SAP user ID for that, and you got a role, right? Well, the business person, the HR person, why can't they just give you the new user information, first name, last name, email address, and role, and just supply that, and it goes off and do it? Why do I have to have an HR person log into SAP, go to the user maintenance screen, create a user, select the thing? Why can't I just have it do that, right? And if there's an API to do that, that's even better, right? And I think you take it, from an RPA standpoint, you put that into a service catalog, right? And you do new user, right? And you tie if every onboarded user has to have an SAP ID, well, guess what? They also have to have an Exchange ID as well, right?
Sure.
And you do those in sequence, and then it just, you fill out the information on the form and on the catalog, and the bots go off and they do that, right? Or you can have, the ETL example that you gave as well, is you could have bots that are just sitting there waiting for the data to come in, because the data comes in all the time, where it's not on a service catalog. It's actually running in the background passively.
Yeah, I mean, two great reasons for bots is bots don't go on vacation, so there's no delay or delegation of duties, so bots don't go on vacation. And secondly, bots only know how to do what they're told to do. Same thing for functional test automation, but they only know how to do what they're told to do. They're not going to make a deviation and then they're skip a thing or go, oh, darn, I forgot to select one of the 5 roles because I'm a human being and I get distracted and things happen. It's fine. You have to have those burdens on you.
They are garbage in, garbage out, though, right? If you don't,
oh, they are. They only know how to do what they're told, for sure.
Yep, absolutely.
And actually, just like when requirements come in that change your application, that need you to maintain and change your tests, when there's functional changes required, the same thing with RPA. If all of a sudden an additional field is required to make a new SAP user, well, yeah, the bot's going to need some work there, for sure.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know this went way longer than we normally do, but as you and I have talked about before, we could sit here and talk about whatever and meander through all kinds of different. We pretty much stayed on topic of just test automation. And I hope the audience appreciates the Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz reference of GUI, API, headless, or UX. Oh my, which one should we do when? And if you do have questions or comments or feedback, feel free to put that into the comments or reach out to myself. And I'm sure Chris will be happy to take some questions as well if you have questions. Thanks, everybody, and look forward to our next session that'll be coming out shortly.
Bye. Thank you so much.
If you liked the video, please click the like button. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you get notified when we release new videos.